serve as the Executive Vice President of the Council for Agricultural Science and Technology, or CAST. Very pleased to share our most recent CAST commentary on economic impacts of COVID-19 on food and agricultural markets. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available for later viewing on the CAST and NCFAR websites. As noted in the agenda, we will have a Q&A session with a panel of authors from today's commentary task force following our main presentation. We'll be opening up the chat box in a few minutes for you to submit questions. Next slide, please. As a member of the National Council for Food and Agricultural Research Board, I am very pleased that this webinar is being hosted by NCFAR. NCFAR is a nonprofit, nonpartisan, census-based and consumer-led coalition that brings together food, agriculture, nutrition, conservation, and natural resource stakeholders together with the food and agricultural research and extension community. It serves as a forum and a qualified voice in support of sustaining and increasing public investment in the food and agriculture research, extension, and education system. Next slide, please. Now in its 16th year of hosting lunch and learn Hill seminars, NCFAR regularly presents leading edge researchers working to provide science-based answers to pressing issues confronting the nation. The Hill Seminar Series provides timely information to Hill staff and other stakeholders and helps demonstrate the value of public investment in food and agriculture research. An investment that returns 45% per year on average and $20 in economic benefit for every dollar invested in food and agriculture research. Next slide. On behalf of NCFAR, I'd like to thank all of the organizations and groups that help support the Lunch and Learn series and make it possible. Next slide. NCFAR works closely with the USDA Research Education Economics Mission Area. Our goal through these seminars is to share the important information and resources that are possible because of the investments in publicly funded research. Next slide. CAST was formed in 1972 to bring together provide balanced, credible, science-based information about food and agriculture to policymakers, the media, the private sector, and the public. CAST is a membership-based organization comprised of scientific and professional societies, nonprofit organizations, universities, companies, and many individuals. Next slide, please. It is through our network of members and member organizations that we select our topics for CAST papers, as well as access a network of scientists, economists, engineers, and other subject matter specialists who help produce those papers. Next slide. CAST has a small staff located in Ames, Iowa. Much of the work that CAST produces is through the volunteers who serve on our governing boards, task force that compile and write papers, and reviewers that make sure our papers are unbiased and based upon sound science. Over the past 13 years, we've involved over 800 subject matter specialists who graciously volunteer their time, energy, and expertise to help us accomplish this work. Next slide, please. Our publications and information are intended for audiences of policymakers, the media, private sector, public, and educators. We do this to help increase the accessibility, awareness, and understanding of the science, technology, and innovation that are so critical to food and agriculture. Next slide. If you visit our website, you will see several different types of CAST publications. Our most popular are our CAST issue papers and commentaries. We also produce an Ag Quickcast for each of the papers that serves as an easy-to-access executive summary of key information. We also recently introduced a student study guide, which we hope will be used by teachers and students to learn more about current food and agricultural science issues. Listed on our website, you will also find other CAST papers that we'll be releasing over the next several months and for the rest of 2020. Next slide, please. The use of social media is an important part of our science communication efforts. I would invite you to join us on any of these platforms. Again, just a reminder that today's webinar is being recorded. At the beginning of the presentation, the chat box will be opened up and you'll be able to submit questions that'll be put before our panelists later in the presentation. Next slide. This commentary is a collaboration between CAST and the Agriculture and Applied Economics Association, or AAEA. One of our scientific and professional society members, we appreciate the opportunity to work with them produce and share this timely and relevant information. Since early May, when this topic was originally proposed, both organizations have worked together closely to produce this paper, and we are pleased to be able to share it with you today. Next slide, please. Like all of our publications, this paper was compiled and written by a task force of volunteer subject matter specialists. Today's paper was task force, which was co-chaired by Dr. Jayson Lusk and Dr. John Anderson. Other two authors joining us today include Dr. Alison Davis and Dr. Timothy Richards. Dr. Jayson Lusk is a distinguished professor and the head of Department of Agricultural Economics at Purdue University. Dr. John Anderson is the professor and head of Agricultural Economics and Agribusiness at the University of Arkansas. Dr. Alison Davis is the H.B. Price Professor of Agricultural Economics at the University of Kentucky, and also the Executive Director of the Community and Economic Development Initiative of Kentucky. Dr. Timothy Richards is the Morrison Chair of Agribusiness at the W.P. Carey School of Business at Arizona State University. Now I'd like to turn the program over to Jayson Lusk to make some introductory comments and to lead us into our presentation. Jayson?
Great, thanks, Kent. It's a pleasure to be here with you all this morning, and I want to thank the leadership of CAST and also the leadership of the AAEA, the Agricultural and Applied Economics Association, for providing us the framework for pulling together this document. You can see the authors of the underlying written report on this slide in front of you. I just want to acknowledge all of their hard work and contributions. The final paper, which I hope you all will have a chance to read and take in, has about 12 individual papers by these authors. Each paper is fairly short, about 1,000 pages, and it covers a wide range of topics. And you're just going to see a small handful of the topics that we're going to touch on here today. I will say, I think, sometimes academic related organizations are not known for being the fastest to respond to issues. So I'm proud that both CAST and AAEA could get this out in a relatively timely manner. We're far enough out from some of the most significant disruptions that we can have some perspective, but we're not so far away that hopefully this information isn't still timely and relevant. Next slide, please. We can go on to the next one. I thought I would just start by giving a broad overview of what I see as the main economic disruptors that we've seen during this pandemic. So really in early March, if you look at the data, you can already see consumers starting to respond in the grocery store by beginning to increase their purchases of certain items. And it was really in mid to late March that the most significant disruptions started to occur. And these are really two demand side shocks. And I'm mentioning these, separating these shocks out because I think folks sometimes get a little confused about the myriad of disruptions that we've seen in the food sector. But what happened? There were two demand shocks at the same time going in opposite directions. There was a near destruction of demand and food away from home in restaurant, cafeteria settings, and then a corresponding increase in demand at the grocery store setting. And that's when we saw some of the peak stock out periods. Really, the food sector responded pretty remarkably, and we had a return to normalcy within a few weeks. By and large, there were still some empty shelves, but we started to see a grocery store that looked more what we're accustomed to really by early to mid-April. But then beginning in late April and mid-May, we had a different kind of shock. This was a supply side shock that came from the shutdown of big meat packing plants, beef and pork in particular, and resulted in some significant reductions in processing. Fortunately, at the moment, we've recovered in large part from those disruptions to meat packing. We're also starting to see a recovery in food away from home. I sure hope that I don't have to add another one of these rectangles, or I'm sorry, squares at the end of this in another couple of weeks. Next slide, please. So I think, looking at the implications of these shocks through prices is instructive. I'm going to show you some animal product related prices. I know in just a minute, Tim is going to show you some price movements in the the vegetable sector. So on the left-hand side, you can see daily wholesale pork and beef prices. That first little peak is whenever the stocking up period occurred in grocery store. And then the fall in prices, I think, is reflective of the fact that aggregate demand had probably fallen because of the shutdown and food away from home. And then when the meat packing plants began to shut down, we saw this enormous increase in wholesale prices. Beef wholesale prices in particular reached the highest level we've seen, at least in nominal terms, in recorded history. Pork got up there pretty close. Chicken is an interesting situation on the right-hand side. This is weekly data. Prices during this whole period have been below where we saw last year at this same time. Eggs was a really interesting case study, a big increase in price in mid to late March and early April. This was largely due to the inability, the challenge of moving eggs from one supply chain, food away from home, to restaurants, both because of regulatory issues that prevented eggs from moving from one system to the other, and also just simply due to things like packaging. The way we ship eggs to restaurants is different than the way we ship eggs to grocery stores, and there just simply weren't enough cardboard, styrofoam crates to go around us to ship us the eggs the way we buy it in grocery stores. And that kind of story played itself out in different ways for a number of different sectors. Next slide, please. You can see some of these same shocks through foot traffic data. So this is a little creepy, but there are some companies that track our cell phone movements through some of the apps that we download. And so this shows just, our locations this year compared to last year in two places. The top is supermarkets, and you can see that spike that happened, and again in mid-March, the peak kind of stocking out period. And then we've been below that since that time. Now, that doesn't mean we're spending less in supermarkets. In fact, we're spending more, but even though we're not visiting them as often, we're buying more when we go, and we're using more e-commerce. The big change, of course, there's a graph of sit-down restaurants, the big fall off that happened in mid-March, but you can see we've had a fairly steady increase since then, not back to normal, but certainly better than where we were in mid to late March. I say better in terms of spending, although I know there's some public health concerns associated with that too. Next slide. This is just a graphic I thought I'd throw up of a publication we put out at Purdue, and I think some of the challenges people have observed in our food system, I think it's been almost paradoxical to say, how is it that we have these images of milk being dumped or vegetables being plowed under at the farm? At the same time, we have scarcity at the retail sector, and the answer is because a lot of our farm products have to go through processors in the middle, and those processors, because of capital requirements, sometimes aren't easily able to adjust from one supply chain to the other, or in the case of meatpacking, sometimes their workers were affected. They weren't able to run at full capacity, and so it's that the middle of our food supply chain that's more concentrated that caused some of the disruptions I think that we've seen. Next slide, please. And maybe just to give you a little bit of illustration of that, these are the red dots there are the locations of the 15 largest pork packing plants, and the blue dots are the 15 largest beef packing plants. These plants, the dots that you see, are responsible for 60% roughly of all cattle and all hogs processed in this company. In good times, this level of concentration gives is associated with economies of scale. It means we have affordable meat for consumers. The challenge is if any one of these plants is closed down for any reason, it's large enough to have significant disruptions in the entire supply chain. And that's what we saw. You can see that in the next slide. These are daily processing volumes, and comparing this year to last year at roughly the same time period. And again, late April, early May, you can see both cattle and hog processing was about 40% below where we were at the same times last year. Interestingly, chicken processing is down a little bit relative to last year, but never has it been less than 6% from where we were last year during this entire pandemic period. So, when you reduce processing volumes by 40%, that's going to cause some significant market disruptions, both to the retail consumer and to livestock producers, as we've seen. Next slide, please. So, I've just hit the surface of many of the topics that are covered in the report. I co-authored a chapter with Jill McCluskey at Washington State University where we talked some about the consumer psychology during that stocking up period. It doesn't have to be explained by irrational behavior. Consumers had probably reasonable expectations about their mobility, about the future availability of foods and prices that led to some behavior we've seen. I think there's going to be a lot of interesting discussion about how consumers' attitudes towards food and food items may change. There'll be a lot of discussion. Hopefully we'll have some time to touch on this in the Q&A that follows. And so please, if you have questions for me or any of the other panelists, put those in and we'll try to get to them. About resiliency, how we have a food system that is more resilient. I think a lot of discussion about how we buy food and what it will look like in the future. Probably we've seen a big increase in online sales. A lot of controversy has come up about price movements, both at the farm and retail level, and what explains those. A lot of talk about regulation and impacts of regulations that prevented food from flowing, and also what regulations might benefit us in the future. There's a chapter on macroeconomics, on trade issues, and then also some topics touched on in the written report related to food insecurity and also food waste at home. So again, I hope you all have a chance to download and look at the physical copy of the report. So at this point, I'm going to turn the program over to my friend and colleague, Tim Richards.
All right, thanks, Jayson. Awesome summary as per usual. I just want to follow up with Jayson's comments, specifically on the fruit and vegetable industry and on retailing kind of more generally. Next slide, please. All right, so I'm going to emphasize three themes. I'm going to talk a little bit about the supply chain resilience notion that Jayson referred to, and the whole idea about how the fruit and vegetable industry responded to that loss of the food away from home and the food service channel, which is a big part of the fresh produce industry in the United States. I'm going to look a little bit more deeply at the shift to online retailing, and not just the data on what's happened. It's fairly obvious, but maybe the longer term implications for how not just fruit and vegetable, but food in general is going to be sold online, and some of the implications for what's going to happen to food markets as a result. And then I'm going to look at the importance of labor in the food supply chain. Nowhere else in agriculture is labor more important than fruit and veg. So it's something that has yet to play out, I think, fully, because we're just in the harvesting season now. So I'm going to talk a little bit more detail about some of the policy options and some of the dynamics that are happening, right now. Next slide, please. Okay, next slide. All right. So as Jayson mentioned, one of the primary shocks to the food industry in general was the almost complete loss of food service. In general, in the United States, the amount of food expenditure is about 50-50 between food away from home or all sorts of food service, including schools and hospitals and such, and 50% at home. The problem is it's a bit of a data issue because we really don't know about the volumes at food away from home. So we have to kind of back it out and figure out exactly how much that volume shock was. We can infer that if we know that these expenditure amounts are roughly the same. We find some broad data that shows that prices for food away from home for equivalent products are roughly double. So that means that food service is roughly 33% of the volume of fruit and veg specifically going into the food supply system every year. So that 33% is obviously a huge amount of the food entering the system. So what happened to that volume? We all saw the news articles about, crops being plowed under. A lot of it was wasted, not just, at the farm, but in homes as people overpurchased and things like this as they stocked up. A lot of it did move to retail, not all of it. And we'll see some data here in a second that showed that people got better at it. Firms got better at it over time and moving to retail. Some of it was purchased by the federal government through some new programs that surprisingly came on super fast. Farmers to Families Food Boxes program is one of them. Okay, next slide. This is a graph that obviously has been making its way around exactly the same source of data as Jayson's. I just showed what happened to the retail visits. Again, as Jayson mentioned, that shock when everybody was out stocking up, and then the drop after as people worked through their pantries and they learned how to shop online. And next slide, please. I have a bunch of different graphics that I could share with you if you're interested, but this I found to be representative of what was actually going on. The thing is about fruit and veg, it's hard to make generalizations because there's hundreds of individual commodities, and the markets for each are fundamentally different. Potatoes, though, is obviously one of the largest and one of the most interesting to follow. In this graphic, I show just AMS food shipments. Now, this is one of the problems, again, in dealing with retail and food service is that we don't have good data for food service. So this shows shipments from the farm. So it's kind of agnostic as to where it's going, to retail or food service. The interesting thing about potatoes, though, is that it's a very regional market. Idaho it has most of the food service market, for French fries and things like that, whereas Colorado is one of the major shippers that focuses primarily on retail. So this is an interesting graphic because it shows that the green Colorado line relative to the red Colorado line, that shows that bump as people stocked up on things that are going to last a little while longer. Potatoes are perishable, but they are relatively storable within the home over a fairly long period of time. But this shows how Idaho kind of fell off the table as food service demand for potatoes fell. But the most important point to note is that by week 24, which is last Friday, we are pretty much back to normal with respect to food service and retail shipments. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so the whole shock, though, the fact that it took 3 or 4 weeks for the industry to re-equilibrate, if you want, kind of showed to us that food system wasn't necessarily as resilient as what we thought. As Jayson mentioned, there's reasons why these firms became concentrated over time, and the focus for generations was on efficiency. But we learned through this process that efficiency doesn't necessarily mean resilience. So I think this lack of resilience, though, is kind of a natural market response to the fact that we've got fixed costs and setting up specific packaging, specific contracts, transportation, logistics, and things like that. Anytime you have uncertainty and fixed costs, there's a phenomenon called hysteresis. You're going to stick with your old decision just because there's a chance that it's going to make sense again. So that begs a question, though. What do we do to improve resilience? Well, really, I don't think there's much of a policy solution. Maybe I'm a free market guy coming from a business school, but I think it's going to be a learning opportunity for firms. They're going to learn that they need to become more resilient, and there's a whole school of thought that this flexibility that firms are going to invest in is kind of the flip side of that hysteresis phenomenon I talk about. Again, next slide, please. All right, so as I mentioned, one of the key impacts is a move to online shipping, and Jayson alluded to that as well. This is just one graphic from Nielsen and Rakuten that shows just within different CPG, consumer packaged goods categories, the extent of that move. By mid-April, people were getting used to shopping online and things. So the natural question to ask then is, what are the long-term implications for this accelerated move to purchasing online? Next slide, please. In general, the major differences between shopping online and shopping in the store is lower search costs. Lower search costs, defined generally, including physical, cognitive, transportation, all sorts of costs. And there's some literature on that generally in the business world. There's five primary implications for food shippers, though. In general, when people shop online, they tend to buy larger baskets. They tend to search more intensively because their search costs are lower, so they can focus on those things that they want. They're less likely to purchase on impulse because they can make lists and they can just hit a button and get the same things over and over again. From a firm perspective, there's a real demand for complementary infrastructure investments. What does that mean? That means that they're going to invest more in their websites. They're going to invest more in ship to curb, in the last mile delivery to households, all those sorts of things that go with purchasing online. And probably most interesting, the long-term effect is going to be because consumers have lower search costs. There's what we call a long tail from searching. Just to summarize the long tail theory, it basically means that instead of having 20% of your products responsible for 80% of your sales, it's going to be the other way around. It's going to be those slow moving, those niche products that are going to represent most of what you sell. Think of Amazon, Netflix back when it was only DVDs, sales and things like that. Next slide, please. So what are the primary economic implications of that? Well, in general, when online shopping first started, and I'm talking generally for digital products and books and things like that, there was this fear that with lower search costs, one of the main assumptions of perfectly competitive markets is that we have zero search costs. So everybody drew the line directly between low search costs and perfect competition. And they're saying all these markets that are online are going to be commoditized, that there's going to be no profit, margins are going to fall. And even for food products, we're going to have this, perfect competition in retail sales. But if you look at that retail long tail sort of argument, and you look at the fact that people search more intensively for when they have lower search costs, they're going to be more likely to search for those real specific items, those attribute sets, we call them, that they really want. So there's a large theoretical literature that actually shows that these lower search costs can lead to higher equilibrium prices. Now, we was curious about this years ago, so we got a hold of a whole bunch of data from ComScore. It's a web behavior panel, super cool data set that showed that this was in fact true. When people were able to search for very specific food items, the retail prices actually did increase. Okay, next slide, please. All right, final theme, talking about labor. We know that for many fruit and vegetable products, labor is the majority share of input costs. Lettuce, almost 50%. For some tree nuts, it can be up to 80%. So we know that labor is incredibly important, even relative to the meat industries that Jayson referred to earlier. Next slide, please. All right, so you probably read tons of media coverage over access to foreign labor in the fruit and vegetable industry. Just in the last couple weeks, we've had reports of, as the harvest starts in the U.S. Southeast and in California in earnest, that there's been disease outbreaks and things like that among workers. So there's a real concern over how we're going to maintain the safety for those workers. In general, there's been an increasing reliance on guest worker programs in the U.S. The H-2A program was created in the mid 80s, but because it has been a bureaucratic nightmare, it's a very cumbersome application process. It takes a long time. Growers didn't really want to deal with it. So they've learned over time, though, and as I'll show in the slide, a graphic in the next slide, it has become a major source of data, but there has been a real concern in the industry over what's happening in real time right now with access to H-2A labor, whether or not workers are willing to cross the border, whether or not growers are willing to ensure their safety and things like that. So this is data just gathered last week from the Department of State. The actual number of visas issued for H-2A workers in May was in 2019 was about 24,300, and it's just a little bit higher this year. So that's very good news because it looks like growers are able to access the kind of labor that they need. Next slide, please. So next, this is the graphic. It just shows that graphic, though, just showed the growth in the program over time. You can see that in the early 2000s, about 50,000 workers a year, and it's 5 times that size now. Surprisingly, Georgia is the largest state, the biggest user of H-2A. Next slide, please. There's kind of ironically, there's a fix for many of the problems I referred to with H-2A. It looks like it's going to die in the Senate Judiciary Committee. It resolves many of the issues that growers have had, and it's supported by most agricultural organizations. Most importantly, it creates a certified agricultural worker status, which is kind of a path to a green card after 10 years. But from a grower perspective, most importantly, it makes the application process, the certification process, a lot more efficient. And for cattle industries, dairy specifically, it makes H-2A available for the first time for year-round workers. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so just to conclude, the 3 major themes were this lack of supply chain resilience, I think, that we've seen, but I don't think, as I mentioned, there's a real policy response because it is that learning opportunity from the industry. Online shopping, the general thought is that it's accelerated our shopping behavior by 10 years. It's not something I think that we really understand well. If we believe that it's going to commoditize retail food, I don't think that's going to be the case. With respect to labor, there was a lot of panic a couple months ago when we looked forward to the harvest season, but early indications are from both the certification and the actual visa granting data are that things appear to be at a very macro level appear to be okay. But one thing to look out for on the policy front is the progress of the Farm Workforce Modernization Act as we move forward. All right, thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It may seem a bit strange to have an economist talking about rural health in this predominantly agricultural discussion, but it's something that I think is critically important for our rural communities, those with or without a significant agricultural presence. So I wanted to start by setting the stage prior to COVID-19. And as we know, rural America is sicker, it's older, and it's poorer than its urban counterparts. And our rural hospitals have had to rely on safety net programs to fund their operations. And over time, our state and federal policies have affected operating margins. In those states that expanded Medicaid, 36% of rural hospitals had a negative operating margin versus 47% of hospitals in those states that chose not to expand Medicaid. Since 2005, 171 rural hospitals have closed, and in the last decade, 130 hospitals have closed. Next slide, please. So the UNC Shep Center produces a financial distress index for rural hospitals, and basically they've suggested that this crisis is far from over, particularly in the South. And in this graphic, you can see where the green is darker is where the larger the number of hospitals are at risk for closure. And not surprisingly, these are the areas where people tend to be have more chronic health conditions and higher rates of poverty. So interestingly, and just as an FYI, rural hospitals, in an effort to identify additional revenue streams, decided to focus on elective procedures and outpatient services. So we'll come back to that. So in actuality, the entire emergency healthcare system was in crisis before COVID-19. We focus a lot on hospital systems, which certainly are critical, but recently, even emergency medical services has received a lot of national attention because of the difficulties local services are having operating care around the clock. I lead the National Center for Economic Analysis for Rural Health, which is funded by the Federal Office of Rural Health Policy. And we have extensively studied EMS and found that difficulties arise for three reasons. First, revenues in rural places are decreasing where population and the economic base are declining. So it makes it very difficult to fund public services. There is a shortage of workers, particularly paramedics and EMTs. And we hear anecdotal stories about places like Amazon that are now hiring paramedics for their factory floor. And as we know, EMTs and paramedics are not high-paying wages compared to the degree of stress and skill that they need. Finally, the opioid crisis, which is not over, but has just kind of made its way away from front page news, has really stressed our emergency medical services due to the way that transportation is billed and left EMS without a lot of revenue for the calls they made. So as a result, services have had to close or reduce their hours. So why is this important? If a farmer has an accident, which we know that we are prone to do, and it takes twice as long for an ambulance to reach that farm, greatly increases the risk of death or permanent disability. If an individual has a stroke and one ambulance in a rural community is already out for a run in another county, the person will die. And this has been shown time and time again. So this was all before COVID-19. So now COVID-19 hits, and it hits urban areas across the nation. And for the most part, rural communities were largely spared from infection. Well, at least those places that were without meat processing facilities or nursing homes. And for those who were diagnosed with COVID-19 and were symptomatic, they were most often transported to urban hospitals, as our rural hospitals did not have the capacity to treat patients, meaning they didn't have ICU beds, they didn't have personal protective equipment, and they didn't have the trained workforce necessary to treat these patients. So in late March, all hospitals were ordered to suspend elective procedures and outpatient services. So remember, I mentioned that earlier. So strangely, as a health crisis is underway, hospitals are furloughing workers, both in urban and rural areas. Next slide, please. So you can see in this map that the hospital traffic is down. The lighter colors down to 33 to 50%. And in the blue colors, it's down by more than 50%. 266 hospitals furloughed their workers, and this is not a scientific database. This was just one entity trying to capture this, and so the numbers could be far larger. And while urban hospitals have come close to returning to full capacity, although we don't know what will happen with the second wave, rural hospitals are far from that moment. They have not yet brought everyone back, and now we see that rural communities are facing increasing infection rates. Next slide, please. So rural Americans face significant barriers that limit their access to healthcare, including proximity, lack of transportation, and a shortage of providers. So one of the positives that came out of this pandemic is the use of telemedicine and the policy changes that allowed hospitals and providers to bill insurance for virtual visits. Many rural facilities had invested in this technology in years past. There were some great programs that allowed them to pay for equipment and for software to do telemedicine, but research has suggested that the equipment has been underutilized. So when COVID hit, both rural and urban areas quickly found that telemedicine was a great way to visit with patients and keep everyone safe. So two interesting points to consider. One is telemedicine is only as good as both ends of the connection. We've had a lot of conversations recently about access and adoption of broadband. We know the communities that don't have access to high-speed internet will not be able to take advantage of the technology. During the pandemic, billing rules were loosened to allow for phone visits on the end of the patient, but this policy is set to expire. And so in addition, in any open market where there are profits, there are opportunities for new entities to enter. So there is some concern based on previous history as well that larger urban-based corporations from outside the area will enter and erode the local market, which would create a long-term shortage of local healthcare providers. We certainly saw this happen before when rural hospitals were subsumed by larger systems, resulting in significant changes in the delivery of care, both quantity and quality. So there is a really small window of opportunity for rural places to lead innovative responses. Can they do it? If they don't, then we will be in deep trouble in the long run. Next slide, please. So I mentioned earlier the issues facing EMS. There are a number of struggles facing EMS through the COVID crisis. In some cases, EMS workers are sick and the workforce shortage is exacerbated. EMS workers are treating patients at their home as opposed to taking them to the hospital to avoid exposure to the virus. But I don't know if many of you know this, but in order to be reimbursed by EMS, you actually have to transport the patient to the hospital. So if you do not transport the patient, you do not get paid. In addition, calls are down. We're all a little bit afraid of calling emergency services because we don't want to be in the hospital situation where we're isolated from our family and certainly increase our chance of exposure to the virus. So throw that all on top of the fact that what we have coming is a significant reduction in local tax revenues because of the closure of our restaurants, our retail, and the decline in sales tax base. So this will mean that we will continue to underfund our publicly provided services, including EMS in many rural communities. So needless to say, the future of EMS is a little concerning. Next slide. So in response to financial losses, the hospitals were not left out of the CARES Act. In fact, there were $10 billion set aside for critical access hospitals, which are small hospitals, primarily in rural areas, designed to be sort of the intermediary between the patient, getting them stabilized, and then, if necessary, moving them on to larger urban hospitals. So there were funds set aside for hospitals, health clinics, and community health centers for rural places across the country. No hospital has or will receive less than $1 million, and that distribution varies by the hospital's expenses, not its revenues. These funds for many hospitals might, you think, well, $1 million, that's a lot of money, and it might have offset the loss from the couple of months where they could not conduct the elective procedures, but it is expected to be just a Band-Aid for the loss in the future. In addition, hospitals are eligible for other funds that allowed for them to find ways to prevent, prepare for, and respond to COVID, including buying PPE, doing additional workforce training, trying to get negative pressure rooms and HVAC systems that would promote great air quality and hygiene, as well as continuing to invest in telehealth equipment and software systems. So as this Daily Yonder piece suggests, Most recognize that this is just a temporary fix. And at the end of all of this, those rural communities that cannot maintain a healthcare system, we can't expect those places to be competitive economically. We might expect that population will continue to decline, and which would further exacerbate the problem. So I leave you with wonderful news. Thank you.
Good morning or good afternoon to our attendees on the East Coast. I'm going to wrap us up here fairly quickly. I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions, but I want to hit a few points that I don't think have been made yet about some commodity market, primarily major commodity market impacts of the COVID event, and with a focus on some of the I think more surprising impacts that we've seen from what Jayson, I think, very well described as the multiple and in some cases contradictory shocks that we saw from COVID. So I want to start with our row crop sector. If you could go to the next slide, please. Pretty much what we've seen from COVID-19 can be described fairly accurately in the major row crop sector as an across-the-board reduction in demand. And this hit at a fairly inopportune time because a lot of our commodity producers had been ramping up production in anticipation of a very strong demand environment as we're just closing out the phase 1 deal with China, looking at strong global growth. And to really have the brakes slammed on the demand side by COVID was, in terms of timing, was a really bad shock for a lot of these markets. Now, for some of these major products, the event was just unambiguously a wreck. Corn and cotton, I think, primarily stand out. And here's where I think some interesting effects coming in. The massive, rapid shutdown of the economy in response to COVID really reduced energy prices, and that had particular effects on corn and cotton. With respect to corn, really undermined demand from the ethanol sector, and really for the first time in basically a decade, I think we saw a real slowdown, a dramatic slowdown in ethanol production and ethanol blending just because of the reduction in demand for gasoline. With respect to cotton, the rapid drop in demand did affect milling fairly quickly, but a bigger issue there, or one of the big issues there, is that with lower energy prices, synthetic prices actually fell sharply, and so that had a very negative demand effect, a very negative effect on cotton demand. You look at some other commodities, the stockpiling behavior that took place early that Jayson described probably did provide some benefit. If you look at the food grains, rice and wheat, for instance, some short-run effects there from stockpiling as we were pulling demand ahead that might have looked positive. But overall, again, I think we're dealing with unambiguously negative effects for this sector. And in the row crop sectors, because of where we are in the production cycle here in the Northern Hemisphere, we're really probably going to see those effects develop over the rest of the marketing year. So I don't think the book is closed. Excuse me. I'm sure the book is not closed on COVID effects in the row crop sector, that there could be some long delayed effects as we see this kind of chronic slowdown in demand as harvest volumes start to hit the market later this year. So that's one that I think we need to stay tuned to, because the major effects of this might actually be down the road, more related to harvest time. Next slide. Livestock and poultry, I think one of the most interesting sectors in terms of the behavior in response to COVID. I think this is something that's going to be studied for many, many years to come. Jayson talked about some of this in his intro, and I don't want to plow ground that he's already covered, but I do want to talk about a couple of things. This initial effect of the surge in demand, I think, surprised a lot of us with how different the effects on specific products were. For example, if you look at what happened with steaks versus roasts in terms of wholesale prices, you know, steaks really suffered from that loss of retail market, but roast benefited from the concentration on grocery retail. Several of those wholesale products experienced that kind of thing. One of the more interesting ones, I think, and one that's been under the radar for a lot of people is the poultry sector. The effects of COVID on the poultry sector were not so much product specific as they were company specific and even production complex within companies, because a lot of companies specialize in either a food service outlet or a retail outlet by production complex. And so growers, for example, that were connected to a complex that was heavily tied into food service suffered large losses, and they suffered them very quickly in this event. Growers who were connected to a complex supplying grocery retail may have actually seen their production increase and noticed very little disruption so far. Eventually, the disruption got around to everybody, but those initial effects were pretty interesting in terms of how different they were based on the supply chain that a producer was tied into. These later effects on the supply chain of the processing plant disruptions have been massive and created some constraints on our ability to harvest animals in a timely fashion that really will be affecting the market for the rest of the year. I think this is particularly true for cattle, where we really, because of the short run situation with processing capacity, have created a backlog situation in our feedlots, and that'll take probably months to actually work through if you look at the most recent, for example, cattle on feed data. So that effect, even though the immediate event has mostly passed, the effect is going to be with the market for a while. And I think that's something that a lot of people are maybe not familiar with. Next slide. Forestry and wood products, one we maybe don't talk as much about as some of our other commodity markets, but again, very interesting effects from COVID. None of us will soon forget the great toilet paper freakout of March 2020. That has a big effect on pulpwood demand. So pulpwood demand, paper product demand has really surged. Toilet paper was part of that. Online shopping is part of that, right? The demand for packaging and boxes and things like that. So it's kind of a good news, bad news situation in the forest and wood products market. The paper and pulpwood products have done very well. Not large farm level effects on price from this, because we have kind of been in an oversupply situation for a long time in that sector, but certainly in terms of consumer demand, a lot of strength there. For the sawn timber market, which is the higher value component of that market, the effect of COVID has been bad and fairly dramatically so in a lot of ways. 30 to 60% work reductions in the Southeast. I think it's similar in other parts of the country. How quickly that market recovers is going to have a lot to do with how quickly the general economy recovers, and specifically, of course, what happens with the housing market as we move forward. But certainly a kind of best of times, worst of times situation in the forest and wood products market because of the differential effects of this event. Next slide. In terms of ag finance, Alan Featherstone wrote a piece for us on ag finance and the financial situation generally in agriculture. He picked up a number from FAPRI, the Food and Ag Policy Research Institute at Missouri, indicating a very preliminary estimate, I would add, of a $20 billion loss in farm income due to COVID. Now, if you match that up against the $16 billion CFAP program in the CARES Act, that looks like pretty good coverage. I think it remains to be seen how well that emergency compensation lines up with losses across sectors and really across time. Like I said, we're going to be dealing with some lingering effects of COVID that we may not fully appreciate right now. But overall, even with the CFAP program, we have to expect farm profitability to be stressed in 2020. And keep in mind that this is following a number of years of relatively low returns in the sector. So financial stress will mount in the sector. I think we have to expect that. Overall, if you look at the condition of lenders, if you look at the financial position in the market, we should be able to weather this first wave of COVID effects without major disruption. We should see financing remain generally available in the sector. Obviously, there will be some individual losses. Producers in kind of a marginal financial position will certainly suffer, but overall, the sector should be able to weather this storm, barring a recurrence or a resurgence of COVID that compounds the effects we've already seen. But that is something, obviously, that is not out of the question and we need to keep an eye on. Next slide. I want to close now with a little bit more forward-looking take on priorities for the profession as we move into this new COVID environment and we move beyond the initial shocks. What are the research and outreach priorities for our profession, for agricultural economists generally? On the research side, a lot of these priorities relate to improving the resilience of supply chains. We've already heard a lot about that from Jayson and Tim. A lot of research agendas are being adjusted right now to look at the kind of issues we will need to address to ensure more resilient supply chains. There will be a lot of focus on the meat processing sector because of the scale of the disruptions in that sector and the attention it got. Also, research to help facilitate more nimble logistical arrangements in the food supply chain. And an example there is how might we more efficiently move between food service and grocery retail chains to avoid some of the waste and loss and disruption that we saw there. Local food systems, regional food systems have been talked about as a possibility for improving supply chain resilience. And I think a lot of work is going to focus on how do we foster those kind of networks and help those develop effectively, and what size, what kind of role can they play in making the food system more resilient. Worker protections and ag labor issues will be a big deal. How do we ensure that workers are taken care of and that we have a deep enough pool of labor to deal with shocks like this? Food assistance and responsiveness of food assistance will be a big deal. This obviously has been, we all saw the massive lines outside of food banks, for instance, and it really highlighted the importance of food assistance and how we can get that to people in a timely manner. So research around improvements there will be a priority. Technology adoption and regulation will be a big part of our research agenda, and that's going to include technology adoption at the farm level to improve production practices and the breadth of products that are available to the market, but also how we might use technology more effectively to improve supply chain resilience. Obviously, the relationship between environmental degradation and disease will get some attention. COVID is a novel zoonotic, and it has demonstrated how dramatic those events can affect our markets, and so being able to better anticipate those will be useful. And finally, international trade and how we maintain international trade in the face of a pandemic when protectionist sentiment is high and when just the sanitary and phytosanitary issues are in the forefront of people's minds. How do we continue to foster trade in those environments? Next slide. Finally, with respect to outreach, a lot of overlap here, obviously, and appropriately with research priorities. It's been kind of a short run, long run dichotomy to some extent when we talk about outreach priorities. Every person I know who works in extension has been consumed with the work around damage estimates, which is true in any natural disaster. And this is not unlike what we've seen with natural disasters. We need to know, policymakers need to know how big are the effects. And so there's been a lot of outreach work already around trying to quantify losses. And moving from that, then how do we mitigate those losses? What are the policy alternatives and what are the consequences of various alternatives when we think about policy interventions? So a lot of that work is going on, and a lot of that's been related to the immediate relief situation. Looking down the road, that work is going to transition more to supply chain issues. Okay, what are the policy alternatives and associated consequences around various interventions to change or modify or improve the supply chain? There will be lots of proposals out there around that, and so a great deal of room for applied research and information to inform those discussions. Farm financial management will be a big topic for outreach, specifically looking at financial stress mitigation and how we help people through financial challenges and to avoid financial crisis in the aggregate. Supply chain resilience, already mentioned, will be a big topic of outreach. And here specifically, I'm talking about the interest that there will be in things like local food systems, in ag labor recruiting and retention by producers, alternative enterprise evaluations as a risk management strategy. You know, we've done work on those things. There are a lot of outreach programs that have been developed on those topics over the years. The challenge over the next year or two is going to be to adapt that information specifically to COVID-related and post-COVID specific questions. And finally, in addition to supply chain resilience, there'll be a great deal of need for outreach around what I'm going to call community resilience. You know, Alison talked about rural healthcare, and she's right. There's going to be a tremendous focus on rural healthcare and how we preserve that and improve that moving forward. Rural infrastructure received a lot of attention and is going to continue to receive a lot of attention. You know, when students were not able to go to school and had to study from home and people had to work from home, lack of high-speed internet became not just an inconvenience, but a serious crisis. And that's going to get a lot of attention as we move forward. Local government support is another aspect of community resilience. A lot of communities have lost a lot of their tax base. Tax revenues are going to be way down because of lost sales taxes, for instance. And the great need for outreach to help community leaders figure out how to deal with those challenges as they move forward, at least for the rest of the year and really into next year. With that, I'm going to stop, and I will pass the baton, I think, back to Jayson, and hopefully we have time for some questions.
Yeah, thanks, John, and thanks, Alison and Tim. There's a lot of questions. We unfortunately won't have time to get to them all, but I thought maybe hitting on a couple of the themes that I saw in the questions might be good. There were some folks that asked, you know, where can I find the report? I believe if you go to the CAST webpage, the Council for Agricultural Science and Technology, you can probably find it there. My understanding is that all of these slides will also be made available probably on the CAST website as well. There were lots of questions about meat and what can we do to make the meat sector more resilient? What would be the effects of policies that cause less segregation? What are the impacts on smaller processors? I'll just note that the authors of the report that hit that topic most directly are Lee Schultz at Iowa State, Glenn Tonser at Kansas State. So they have a piece on that in our larger report. I'll just make a couple of comments quickly and let any of the other panelists join in. It's certainly true that our meat sector is very concentrated. And Tim and others talked about the trade-off there between efficiency and maybe resilience. I think the thing that's important to think about when I think about resilience, the problem we had was really a problem of capacity. When a plant closed down, was there enough extra capacity in the system to move other animals around? The challenge is that extra capacity is expensive, and who's going to pay that cost of that extra capacity? There has been a big increase in demand, interest in direct from small packer, small farmer to consumer, but I think one has to recognize the scale of the issue here. So to give an example, our largest pork packing plants process, roughly 20,000 hogs per day. If you have a small packer that does even, 20 head a day, you need 1,000 extra packers to make up for that loss of that one large one. And so, yes, there's certainly room for growth, entrepreneurship in that small processor sector, but I think one also has to be realistic about the relative magnitudes and the volume. I don't know, John, or Tim or Alison, any comments you want to make about maybe more resiliency in the meat sector? The last thing I'll add, maybe there's automation, I think is a big example. The vulnerability here has been because of worker density. And I think there'll be a lot of interest in automation.
Yeah, Jayson, I'll follow up on a couple of your points. I agree with everything you said. The issue of scale is really kind of hard to get your head around. I would just add anecdotally, we have a capacity issue right now in a lot of the country at the small scale local processing level. In my state, in Arkansas, and I know in the surrounding states that I've talked to, Oklahoma and Missouri, for instance, there's great interest in small scale processing local food systems. Right now, everywhere that I've been able to touch base with, if you want to get an apple processed locally, the waiting list right now in Arkansas is about 6 months. That gives you some idea of the scale. We're not trying to dump all of this lost scale into the local system, but even with the growth and interest that we've seen to date, we're running way behind capacity. So the scale of this problem is really massive, and I think is a real challenge. Part of this also, I think, one other point I think relates to the product mix. If you look at the poultry processing, for instance, a big part of one of the more challenging places, I would say, to practice social distancing among workers and to provide for worker protection is on these deboning lines. where workers really do stand pretty close together, and product moves along the line for further processing. Those lines exist because those kind of products have grown tremendously in popularity among consumers. And so we might, in the short run, get some flexibility in our capacity by changing the product mix that's out there. For example, pushing more product out the door as whole chickens instead of boneless, skinless, individually quick frozen chicken breasts. But the market certainly is going to want those higher value products. It's not something we're going to do without indefinitely. So product mix is also a factor when we look at capacity, and I think that's part of what these companies individually have been trying to work out. You know, how do we get product through but still meet the demands that consumers have for the type of products they're accustomed to seeing? And it's a challenging issue.
Right. And further on that theme, just to follow up with what Jayson was saying, one thing that we've seen with respect to online food is not just the big retailers, the Amazons, the Walmarts selling more food online, but the nexus between the food, farmers markets and online shopping. If you want some examples, Seasonal Roots out of North Carolina, Milk Run out of Oregon, killing it. Both of them seeing 6 times growth relative to before COVID. Is that a long run solution to resiliency in the food system? Again, it's a scale issue. I don't think these are still small companies. If we think about the magnitude of a Walmart and a Target and an Amazon and things like that, we've got a long ways to go, but it is an example of how the market's responding and providing resilience sort of, as we say in economics, endogenously.
Tim, do we want to move on to another question?
Yeah, we probably have time for maybe one more question.
Jayson, would you like to? Or Kent, hold that up.
I tell you what, I'm probably over time. Let's go ahead and wrap up. Jeannie, could you please go to the next slide, please? I want to thank all of our presenters and panelists for their participation today. If you submitted a question and we didn't get to it, we will work with the panelists and the other task force authors to get those things compiled, and we will make that available through our CAST website. Jayson referenced the publication. Here's where you can find the information on how to download the publication. Here's also the emails of our 4 panelists today, and then as well as the other panel or the other authors that contributed to the paper. Again, thank you for joining us. Thank you to all of our presenters. A lot of great information. It took us quite a while to get this together, and we're pleased to share it. Look forward to this presentation be posted on our website as well as the NCFAR website. I'd like to thank both NCFAR and then also the Academy of Nutrition Dietetics for their assistance in making this available. So I guess Jeannie will advance to the last slide. And again, thank you all for joining us today.